The first time I heard that my own daughter had been telling people I was crazy, I was standing in line at the pharmacy, counting out exact change because I still do that, even when I don't have to. The woman behind the counter lowered her voice and said, "Your daughter already called. She warned us you might be confused." She didn't look cruel. She looked careful. That was worse. I'm 75 years old. I balance my checkbook. I remember appointments. I still read paper books and finish them. But in that moment, I felt something inside me shift, the way a floorboard gives under your foot when you didn't expect it to. My daughter's name is Claire. I raised her alone after her father died when she was 11. I worked as a school secretary for 30 years, packed lunches, stayed up with fevers, learned silence early. I was never dramatic. I didn't have the luxury. The story she'd been telling didn't begin all at once. It started small. She forgets things. She gets emotional. She doesn't always understand what's best for her anymore. At first, I laughed it off. People my age are allowed a little fog, aren't we? But then, neighbors began speaking to me slowly. My bank asked if I'd brought someone with me. My church friend mentioned, gently, that Claire was so brave for taking care of me. Taking care of me. Claire lives 20 minutes away and visits once a month. She checks my cabinets. She asks if I'm still driving. She sighs a lot, the way tired daughters do in movies. What I didn't know was how much she'd already said. To my doctor, to her friends, to a social worker I'd never met. Always softly, always kindly, always with concern. I found out the full shape of it one afternoon when she sat across from me at my kitchen table, folded her hands and said, "Mom, I think it would be best if you talked to a psychiatrist, just to document things." Document. That was the word she used. She said it wasn't a big deal. She said it would protect me. She said people my age sometimes don't realize when they're slipping. I looked at her face and saw something unfamiliar there. Not fear, not love. Calculation. Careful patience. Like someone waiting for a door to unlock. That night, I lay awake and replayed every conversation from the last year. Every time I'd disagreed with her. Every time I'd said no. Every time she'd smiled and said, "You're being difficult again." I wondered how long she'd been building this version of me, and who else had already accepted it as truth. By morning, I understood one thing very clearly. This wasn't about my mind. It was about control. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. Claire didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin me. That's the truth, and I've had years to think about it. She learned slowly that speaking for me worked better than speaking to me. At first it was harmless. At least that's what I told myself. She'd answer questions directed at me before I could open my mouth. She'd correct me in public, lightly, with a smile. "That's not quite how it happened, Mom." People laughed. I laughed too. I didn't want to seem touchy. When I disagreed with her, she'd tilt her head and say, "You're getting upset again." Not angry, not firm. Upset. As if my opinions were symptoms. I noticed that when I spoke calmly, she called me cold. When I showed emotion, she called me unstable. There was no version of me that didn't fit her story. She began keeping notes. I saw the notebook once by accident, sticking out of her purse. Dates, short lines. Refused help. Suspicious. Raised voice. I asked her what it was for, and she laughed, said it was nothing, said I was imagining things. That word again, imagining. She spoke to my doctor without me in the room. She called my neighbor when I didn't answer my phone quickly enough. She told my cousin I was confused about money, even though my bills were paid and my accounts balanced. She said she worried I'd be taken advantage of. What she didn't say was that I'd started pushing back. I told her I wasn't selling my house. I told her I didn't need her on my bank account. I told her I liked my life the way it was. Quiet, small, mine. That's when her concern sharpened. She'd sigh heavily and say, "This is what I mean." She'd look at others and say, "See how defensive she gets?" People believe daughters, especially calm ones. Especially daughters who use the right words and never raise their voices. I began to feel myself shrinking, not because I doubted my memory, but because every sentence required defense. Every thought needed proof. It's exhausting to exist under suspicion. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone in the hallway. She didn't know I was home. I heard my name. I heard the word delusional, spoken gently, like a diagnosis already agreed upon. I didn't confront her. I made tea. I sat down. I waited. When she finally came into the kitchen, she smiled and asked if I was feeling okay. The way she said it made my stomach turn. Not cruel. Concerned. Practiced. That was when I realized something important. She wasn't trying to convince me I was unwell. She was trying to convince everyone else, so that if I ever said otherwise, it wouldn't matter. By the time she suggested the psychiatrist, the ground had already been prepared. I was the problem. She was the solution. And I was expected to be grateful. I agreed to the appointment not because I doubted myself, but because I knew this much. If I refused, it would be written down. There is a particular kind of doubt that doesn't shout. It seeps in quietly, like cold through old windows. I didn't suddenly believe I was losing my mind. That would have been easier. Instead, I began questioning how I was perceived, whether my words sounded different than I thought, whether my pauses were too long, whether my certainty came across as stubbornness. Claire never accused me outright. She didn't have to. She'd simply say things like, "Do you remember that clearly?" Or, "That's not how you told it last time." Always calmly, always gently, always in front of someone else. I started replaying conversations after they ended. Standing in the kitchen at night, washing a cup I hadn't used, trying to remember my exact tone. Did I raise my voice? Did I interrupt? Was I sharp? This is how it works. You don't lose your grip on reality. You lose your confidence in defending it. At the grocery store, I caught myself rehearsing what I'd say to the cashier, just in case. At the doctor's office, I brought notes so I wouldn't forget anything, then worried that the notes made me look worse. I spoke more carefully, slower, as if walking on ice. Once I misplaced my glasses. They were on my head. I laughed it off, but later that night I lay awake thinking, what if she hears about this? Not because it meant anything, but because it could be used. Every ordinary mistake became evidence waiting to be collected. I noticed that Claire never interrupted me when I sounded uncertain, only when I was firm. If I said, "I think," she nodded. If I said, "I know," she frowned. Confidence irritated her. Hesitation suited her narrative. There was a day I truly frightened myself. Not because I forgot something, but because I almost apologized for nothing. She accused me of being rude to her friend, a woman I barely spoke to. I opened my mouth to say, "I'm sorry," then stopped. I had no memory of being rude. None. I remembered the conversation clearly, pleasant. short, uneventful. I didn't apologize, and Claire's eyes changed, just for a second. A flash of something hard. That night, she sent me a long message about my lack of insight, about how resistance was common, about how she loved me but couldn't ignore the signs. I sat at my kitchen table reading it 3 times, my hands steady, my heart slow. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't confused. I was being redefined. The most dangerous part wasn't her words. It was my silence. I'd spent decades being agreeable, being easy, being the woman who didn't make scenes, and she was counting on that muscle memory. I thought of all the years I'd told Claire to stay calm, to explain herself, to be reasonable. I had raised her to speak well, to sound credible. She was using every lesson. When the appointment letter arrived, already scheduled, already confirmed, I held it for a long time. White paper, black ink, neutral language, psychiatric evaluation. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the same tree I'd watched for 15 years lose another branch in the wind. I understood something then that I hadn't allowed myself to think before. If I let her tell my story, I would disappear inside it. And once a woman my age is labeled unstable, there is no arguing your way back. So I decided on one thing, quietly, without telling anyone. I would say exactly what was true. Nothing more. Nothing less. And I would let someone who didn't love me, didn't need me, and didn't benefit from my silence decide whether I was crazy. That was the first moment I stopped being afraid. Claire chose the psychiatrist. She said it casually, as if that detail didn't matter. I found someone very experienced, she told me. He works with older patients. He'll know what to look for. What to look for? The appointment was set for a Tuesday morning. She offered to drive me. I said no. She insisted. I said no again. That was noted, I'm sure, somewhere in her head. You don't have to be so resistant, she said, already tired of me. I'm just trying to help. The night before, she called twice to remind me of the time. She texted once more in the morning, each message polite, careful, written as if someone else might read it later. When she picked me up, she commented on my clothes. Not unkindly, just enough. That sweater might be a bit much. You don't want to look distressed. I changed it. On the drive, she spoke about paperwork, about how evaluations protect families, about how if something were wrong, it would be better to know early. She kept her eyes on the road, her voice even. I watched her hands on the steering wheel and wondered when she'd learned to sound so sure. The office was quiet. Too quiet. Neutral art. Neutral furniture. The kind of place designed to absorb stories without reacting to them. Claire checked in at the desk before I could speak. She handed over documents I hadn't seen before. She has good days and bad days, she said softly. Sometimes she doesn't realize when she's struggling. The receptionist nodded at her with sympathy. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't correct her. Not then. The psychiatrist came out a few minutes later. He was younger than I expected. Calm. No rush in his movements. He greeted me first, not Claire. Looked at my face when he said my name. That mattered more than I can explain. Would you like your daughter to join us? He asked. Claire answered before I could. I think it would help. He looked at me again. What do you think? It was such a simple question that it almost undid me. I'd like to speak alone, I said. Claire smiled tightly. Of course, if that's what you want. She said it like a concession. The door closed behind me, and for the first time in months, there was no one narrating me. He didn't start with symptoms. He didn't start with memory tests. He asked about my day, about my sleep, about what worried me. So I told him the truth. I told him about the notes, about the way my words were reframed, about being spoken over, about the slow, steady pressure of being treated like a problem that needed managing. I told him I was afraid, not of losing my mind, but of losing my authority over my own life. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to reassure me. He wrote things down, slowly. At one point, he asked, "Has anyone ever benefited from you being seen as unwell?" The question sat between us. "Yes," I said. "My daughter." He nodded, as if that answer fit neatly into a space he already recognized. When the session ended, he opened the door and called Claire in. She sat straighter than before, confident, expectant. He didn't say much then, just that he needed more sessions, that assessments take time, that conclusions can't be rushed. Claire frowned. "But you see what I mean, right?" He looked at her the same way he'd looked at me. Calm, direct. "I see a woman who knows exactly what she's saying," he replied. The drive home was quiet. Claire didn't speak. Neither did I. But something had shifted. I could feel it, deep and steady. For the first time since this began, the story was no longer entirely in her hands. The second appointment came a week later. Claire asked if I wanted her to come in with me again. Her voice was careful, neutral, already prepared for either answer. I told her no. She nodded, but I saw the tension in her jaw. She liked being present. She liked managing the room. This time, I drove myself. I arrived early and sat in the car for a few minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, reminding myself of simple facts: my name, my age, the date. Not because I was confused, but because I was done letting anyone suggest that I was. Inside, the psychiatrist greeted me the same way as before. By name, with eye contact, with no hurry. He asked me to describe a recent disagreement with my daughter. Not the worst one, not the most dramatic. Just an ordinary one. So I told him about the curtains. Claire wanted me to replace them, said they were old, depressing, not good for my mood. I told her I liked them. They were thick. They kept the heat in. They reminded me of my late husband, who'd helped hang them years ago. She said that attachment to objects was a sign of decline. When I finished, the psychiatrist asked, "Did you feel confused during that conversation?" "No," I said. I felt dismissed. He nodded and wrote something down. Then he asked me something no one had asked before. "How do you feel when your daughter speaks for you?" I didn't answer right away. I had to search for the word. "Erased," I said finally, like I've already been decided. That was when he leaned back slightly and said, "I want to be very clear with you." He told me that disagreement is not pathology, that irritation is not instability, that refusing help does not equal incapacity. He said that what he was seeing so far was not cognitive decline, but a long pattern of relational pressure. He used the words coercive dynamics. I repeated them silently to myself, just to see how they felt. At the end of the session, he explained the next steps: more documentation, a formal report, a section addressing my mental capacity, and another addressing the context in which concerns had been raised. "Your daughter requested this evaluation," he said carefully, "which means the report will be shared with her." I knew that already. Still, my stomach tightened. He looked at me steadily. "Are you comfortable with that?" Yes, I said, and I meant it. Because by then, I understood something important. This wasn't about convincing him. That part was already done. This was about what would happen when the paper existed, when words were fixed, when narratives couldn't be adjusted on the fly. On the way out, I passed Claire in the waiting room. She stood up immediately. "Well?" she asked, smiling too quickly. "He needs more time," I said. Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. "That's unusual." "Is it?" I asked. She studied my face, as if looking for cracks. "You seem very calm." "I am," I replied. At home, she called twice that evening, asked how I was feeling, if I was tired, if the sessions were overwhelming. I answered politely, briefly. I didn't volunteer anything. That night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Old tax documents, utility records, a handwritten list of passwords, evidence of a life managed quietly, competently, without witnesses. I wasn't gathering proof for the psychiatrist. I was gathering it for myself. Because somewhere along the way, I had absorbed the idea that sanity was something that could be taken from me if I didn't guard it. The following week, the psychiatrist called and asked me to come in one more time, alone. His voice was calm, professional. "I've completed the report," he said, "and before it's released, I want to review its conclusions with you." I hung up the phone and sat very still. I thought of Claire, so certain, so prepared. I thought of the people who had already decided who I was based on her words. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel dread. I felt ready. Because whatever was written on that paper, I knew one thing beyond doubt. I had not imagined myself into this situation, and I was no longer willing to shrink to fit someone else's diagnosis. When I came in for the final appointment, the report was already printed. I knew that before I saw it because the psychiatrist didn't have his tablet open. Instead, there was a thin folder on the desk, closed, deliberate. Paper carries weight. Claire understood that. She'd been counting on it. He asked me to sit, not across from him, but slightly to the side, as if this wasn't an interrogation, as if this was a conversation between two adults. "I want to go through this with you carefully," he said. "Not because you need protection, but because you deserve clarity." That sentence alone told me how this was going to end. He began with the formalities: name, age, reason for referral, requested by adult daughter due to concerns about mental stability, decision-making capacity, and possible cognitive decline. I listened without reacting. Those words had already lived in the air around me for months. Seeing them written didn't hurt the way Claire probably hoped they would. Then he read the conclusions. No evidence of cognitive impairment. No signs of delusional thinking. No indicators of mood disorder severe enough to impair judgment. Intact memory. Intact reasoning. Intact autonomy. He paused, looked up at me and said, "In plain language, you are mentally sound." I nodded. I wasn't surprised, but something in my chest loosened anyway. Then he turned the page. This section, he explained, was less common, added when context matters. He read more slowly. The patient demonstrates consistent, coherent self-reporting across sessions. Reports of instability appear externally generated and are not supported by clinical observation. There is evidence of sustained interpersonal pressure, including infantilization, misrepresentation of affect, and repeated attempts to undermine the patient's confidence in her own judgment. I felt my hands go cold. He didn't soften it. He didn't apologize for the words. In my professional opinion, he continued, the primary psychological stressor in this case is not internal pathology, but relational coercion. I had to ask him to stop for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to breathe through it properly. I wanted to remember exactly how it felt. He waited. When my daughter reads this, I asked quietly, what will she hear? He considered that her concerns were not validated, and that some of her behaviors were. And if she tries to use this report against me? I asked. She can't, he said simply. It does the opposite. He told me the report would be sent to her electronically that afternoon. No edits, no omissions. The same version I'd just heard. I thanked him. Not effusively, just once, with meaning. Outside, the sun was sharp and bright. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about how much effort Claire had put into shaping the outcome. The calls, the notes, the careful language, the performance of concern, and how none of it survived a room where she couldn't speak for me. She called me that evening. Her voice was tight, clipped, pretending to be normal. The psychiatrist sent the report. Yes, I said. There was a pause, a long one. I don't understand, she said finally. He completely missed the point. No, I replied. He heard it. She accused him of bias, of being manipulated, of not understanding family dynamics. She said the language was unfair, harmful, extreme. I let her talk. When she finished, I said only one thing. You asked for this evaluation. She went quiet again. The next day, my doctor called to confirm there were no concerns on my record. The bank removed the note Claire had requested, just in case. A neighbor stopped speaking slowly to me. Small things. Quiet shifts. But irreversible. Claire hasn't apologized. I didn't expect her to. People like her don't apologize when control slips. They regroup. But something fundamental had changed. There was now a document that didn't belong to her version of me. A professional record that said, clearly, that I was not confused, not fragile, not incapable. And more importantly, that what had been done to me had a name. At 75 years old, I wasn't relieved to be declared sane. I was relieved to no longer be alone in saying it. After the report was sent, there was a silence that felt unnatural. Claire didn't call the next day, or the day after that. For years, she had filled every quiet space with messages disguised as concern. Now there was nothing. No checking in, no instructions, no reminders. That absence told me more than any argument ever had. I learned later that she hadn't kept the report to herself. She couldn't. She'd already told too many people that I was unstable. Too many versions of me were circulating, and now there was an official document contradicting them. People began calling. My sister asked carefully how I was feeling. Not slowly, not cautiously, normally. A neighbor stopped by with soup and apologized, awkwardly, for assuming things. My doctor's office updated my file and removed Claire as an emergency contact without hesitation. Each small correction felt like a stitch closing an old wound. Claire, on the other hand, unraveled quietly. She contacted the psychiatrist again, requesting clarification. He declined further discussion. She wrote a formal complaint. It went nowhere. She tried reframing the report, telling people it was just one opinion, but the language was too precise, too clinical. It didn't leave room for interpretation. Words like coercive, misrepresentation, undermining autonomy don't wash off easily. She accused me of turning professionals against her, of manipulating the situation, of embarrassing her. I was trying to protect you, she said the next time we spoke. Her voice had lost its softness. And now everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. I didn't say anything, I replied. I answered questions. She didn't like that answer. It gave her nothing to push against. What followed wasn't explosive. It was colder. Invitations stopped. Mutual friends grew distant from her. People didn't confront her. They simply adjusted. They stopped asking her for updates about me, stopped praising her devotion, stopped listening. For someone who lived on quiet authority, that was devastating. I noticed changes in myself too. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped softening my sentences. When someone asked how I was, I said, "I'm well," and meant it. One afternoon, Claire came by unannounced. She stood in my doorway like she used to, arms folded, scanning the room as if looking for signs of disorder. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," I answered. She waited for more, for reassurance, for guilt, for regret. It didn't come. "You know this isn't over," she said finally. "People don't just forget." "I'm not asking them to," I said. She left shortly after that. This time, I didn't feel the familiar pull to follow her to the door, to fix the air between us. The truth is, I didn't win anything dramatic. There was no public reckoning, no apology tour, no justice served with a raised voice. What I gained was quieter. When a woman spends months being told she is unreliable, and a single clear voice says otherwise, it doesn't just correct the record, it restores something internal. I trusted myself again. I trusted my memory, my tone, my judgment. I stopped second-guessing pauses and words. I stopped reviewing conversations at night. Claire had wanted documentation. She got it. Just not the kind she could control. And once that paper existed, the story she'd built collapsed under its own weight. Not loudly, not violently. It simply could no longer stand. At 75, I learned something most people never do. You don't have to defend yourself against lies forever. Sometimes you just have to tell the truth once, to the right person, and then let it do its work. The hardest part came later, when the noise settled and I was left alone with the truth of what had happened. Not the version written in the report, the quieter one. I had trusted my daughter. Not blindly, but deeply. I had believed that whatever sharpness entered her voice over the years came from stress, not strategy. That her impatience was exhaustion. That her concern, even when it stung, was still love. Once the report existed, I began to replay memories with a different lens. Moments I had dismissed returned, clearer now. The way she'd correct me mid-sentence, then smile at others as if smoothing over an embarrassment. The way she'd insist I repeat myself, not because she didn't hear me, but because she wanted witnesses. The way she'd say, "You don't remember that," when what she really meant was, "That doesn't suit me." I saw the pattern I hadn't allowed myself to name. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was practiced. Claire had learned that authority doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from sounding reasonable while someone else sounds emotional by comparison. Sometimes it comes from repeating a claim often enough that people stop checking. She didn't need me to be ill. She needed me to be questioned. I realized then that the report hadn't ruined her life. It had exposed it. The psychiatrist hadn't accused her of malice. He hadn't diagnosed her. He had done something far more dangerous to a controlling person. He had removed her narrative power. After that, people no longer asked her how I was doing. They asked me. She tried to regain ground in small ways, sending articles about aging, leaving pamphlets on my table when she visited, mentioning stress in conversations, as if hoping it would stick. It didn't. I began setting boundaries so simple they startled both of us. No, I don't want to discuss that. This is my decision. I'm comfortable with how things are. She reacted poorly, not with anger, with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how the rules had changed without her consent. One afternoon, she said, "You're being very cold lately." I looked at her and answered honestly, "I'm being clear." That distinction mattered. For the first time, I wasn't trying to soften the impact of my own autonomy. I also noticed something else, something quieter, but more painful. There were people who never came back. Friends who'd accepted her version of me so easily that when it fell apart, they didn't know how to face me again. They chose distance over apology. I let them go. At 75, you don't have the energy to rebuild trust with people who found it so easy to doubt you. There were nights when grief came unexpectedly, not for the relationship I had, but for the one I thought I had. For the daughter I believed I was protecting, even as she learned to use my love as leverage. But grief didn't pull me backward. It clarified. I stopped sharing details of my life with Claire, not as punishment, as protection. I kept my routines, my friendships, my small pleasures private. She noticed. Of course she did. "You don't tell me things anymore," she said once, accusingly. "I tell people who listen," I replied. She stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. Or maybe she was seeing me accurately for the first time. The report had done its work externally. But internally, something else had shifted. I no longer measured myself through her reactions. I trusted the steadiness I'd earned over decades, the kind that survives loss, work, silence, and time. The kind that doesn't need approval to stand. Claire wanted proof that I was unstable. What she got instead was proof that I was finished doubting myself. And that, I think, frightened her more than anything else ever could. The moment Claire realized she had lost control wasn't loud. It didn't happen when she read the report. Not when she argued with the psychiatrist. Not even when people stopped praising her for taking care of me. It happened weeks later in my living room over something small. She was talking about my finances, casually, as if the conversation still belonged to her. "I think it would be smarter," she said, "if we simplified things. Fewer accounts, less responsibility for you." I was sitting in my chair by the window, mending a loose button. My hands were steady, my glasses clean, the afternoon quiet. "No," I said. She blinked. "No? No," I repeated. "That won't be happening." She laughed once, sharply. "Mom, don't be stubborn. This is exactly what I mean." I looked up at her then, really looked. "I know what you mean," I said. "And the answer is still no." She stood up, began pacing. Her voice rose, not into a shout, but into something brittle. She reminded me of my age, of my vulnerability, of how fast things could change. I waited until she finished. Then I said, "You don't get to speak like that to me anymore." The room went very still. She stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language. "What?" "I said," I continued calmly, "you don't get to decide what I can handle, and you don't get to imply I'm incapable when a medical report says otherwise." She reached for her phone. I knew that movement well, the reflex to gather allies, to document, to regain footing. "There's nothing to document," I said. "I'm saying no." That was the moment. I could see it in her face. Not anger, panic. The sudden understanding that the tools she'd relied on no longer worked. She tried one last approach. "You're being influenced," she said. "That psychiatrist put ideas in your head." I smiled then, not cruelly, just enough. "No," I said. "He confirmed what I already knew." She left soon after, drove away without looking back. Later that evening, I received 3 messages. One accusing me of ingratitude. One warning me I'd regret this. One asking if we could start over. I didn't answer any of them, because starting over would have required me to forget, and forgetting would have required me to become small again. Over the next few days, consequences began to ripple outward. Quietly, efficiently. Claire lost access to my medical information, then to my accounts, then to her role as my spokesperson. Each change was procedural, boring even, no drama, no confrontation. She had built her authority on assumption, on being the reasonable one. Once that cracked, there was nothing underneath to hold it up. I heard through others that she was struggling, that she felt betrayed, that she didn't understand how things had turned against her so quickly. But nothing had turned against her. The truth had simply arrived. People often think exposure ruins lives overnight. It doesn't. What it does is remove shortcuts. It forces a person to stand on who they actually are, without leverage. Claire wasn't destroyed by the report. She was undone by the loss of narrative. For the first time, she had to explain herself without me as the problem. And that, I think, was unbearable. As for me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Space. Mental space. Emotional space. The freedom to exist without being monitored. I took longer walks. I stopped rushing through conversations. I let silences sit without filling them. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. At 75, I had learned that dignity doesn't return all at once. It comes back in pieces, in moments where you say no and don't apologize, where you choose quiet over justification. The psychiatrist's report had been the spark, but the fire, the steady, controlled kind, was mine, and it wasn't going out. The fallout didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived in fragments, drifting back to me through other people. A cousin mentioned that Claire had been having a hard time lately. A former friend of hers stopped calling altogether. Someone from church asked me cautiously if I was doing okay now, as if something official had shifted and they weren't sure how to behave yet. They were right. Something had shifted, not dramatically, institutionally. Claire had built her authority quietly, behind closed doors, through conversations that couldn't be checked. Once the report existed, those conversations stopped carrying weight. People didn't confront her. They didn't accuse her. They simply stopped deferring to her. That kind of loss is invisible from the outside, but devastating if you were living inside it. She tried to compensate. She became louder in her certainty, sharper in her tone. She corrected people more often. She explained herself too much. Anyone who has ever watched control slip knows that phase. The overcorrection that only draws attention to what's missing. One afternoon, she called me and said she'd spoken to a lawyer friend. "I just want you to be careful," she said. "These reports can be misinterpreted." "I've read it," I replied. "There's nothing unclear." She paused. Then, very carefully, she said, "You know this doesn't make you right about everything." "I never said it did," I answered. "It just means I'm competent." That word again, competent. She hated it, because competence meant she had no legal, medical, or moral leverage left. It meant her concern had boundaries. It meant she couldn't step in whenever she pleased. She stopped coming by after that. Weeks passed, then months. At first, I felt the old reflex, the urge to reach out, to smooth things over, to make sure she was okay. That instinct didn't disappear overnight. It had been trained into me over decades, but I didn't act on it. I remembered how easily she'd agreed to let me be seen as unstable, how quickly she'd handed my reputation to strangers, how calm she'd been while doing it. Distance wasn't punishment, it was consequence. The real damage to her life didn't come from me. It came from the way people began to look at her once they understood what she'd tried to do. Not with outrage, with caution. They started checking facts, asking follow-up questions, listening for exaggeration. Once you've been exposed as someone who misrepresents reality, even gently, trust doesn't snap back. I heard that her job became harder, that colleagues stopped taking her word at face value, that a promotion she'd expected quietly went to someone else. She blamed me, of course, but I hadn't spoken about her. I hadn't shared the report. I hadn't defended myself publicly. I'd simply stopped participating in the story she told. The report did the rest. I ran into her once, unexpectedly, at the grocery store. She looked thinner, tired. She smiled like someone who wasn't sure which version of me she was allowed to greet. "You look well," she said. "I am," I replied. She waited for me to ask about her. I didn't. That silence said more than any accusation ever could. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You didn't have to let it go this far." I looked at her, really looked, and said, "You didn't have to start it." Her face hardened. She turned and walked away. I stood there among the produce, surrounded by ordinary life, and felt no triumph. Only a steady, quiet certainty. I had not destroyed my daughter's life. I had survived her attempt to manage mine. At 75, I understood something that took me far too long to learn. You don't owe access to people who confuse control with care. You don't owe silence to protect someone who was willing to erase you. And you don't owe guilt when the truth finally does what lies cannot. The psychiatrist's report was just paper, but it forced my daughter to live without the mask she'd relied on. And that, for someone like her, was the real reckoning. The strangest thing was how ordinary my days became after that. No crises, no dramatic phone calls, no one knocking on my door with concern in their eyes. The world didn't collapse just because my daughter no longer managed it on my behalf. Mornings returned to their quiet rhythm. Tea, toast, the radio low. I stopped checking my phone first thing, stopped bracing myself for whatever version of me Claire might be presenting to someone else that day. And yet, the consequences kept unfolding, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. A letter arrived from a legal aid clinic I'd never contacted, addressed to Claire, mistakenly forwarded to my house. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The return address told me enough. She had been asking questions about authority, about next steps, about options that were no longer available to her. She came by a week later, unannounced again. She looked controlled, composed, but there was a tightness around her mouth I hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said. "No," I replied. She blinked. "What?" "I don't need to talk," I said evenly. "You do." She stood there, stunned, as if the floor had shifted under her feet. For years, conversations had happened on her terms when she decided they were necessary. "You're being unreasonable," she said finally. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. That word had lost its sting. "I'm being finished," I said. She tried a different approach then, softer. She spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about how things had spiraled. She said she never meant for it to go this far. That was the moment I understood something fully. She hadn't meant to hurt me. She had meant to manage me. And when management fails, people call it a misunderstanding. "I don't need your explanation," I told her. "I need distance." Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with fury held just below the surface. "You're punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm protecting myself." She left without another word. After that, the calls stopped entirely. I heard from my sister that Claire was telling people I'd become cold, that I'd changed, that I'd shut her out after everything she'd done for me. I didn't correct the story. Let her have that one. Because for the first time, her version of events no longer carried authority. It was just a story, one among many, without institutional backing, without medical weight, without moral urgency. People listened politely. Then they moved on. That was the real loss for her. For me, something unexpected happened. I began sleeping through the night. Not every night, but more often than before. My shoulders loosened. My thoughts slowed. I found myself humming while doing dishes, something I hadn't done in years. Fear takes up space. Once it leaves, something else rushes in. I started seeing friends again, selectively. The ones who hadn't needed convincing, the ones who had waited. One of them said to me over coffee, "I'm glad you stood your ground." I didn't tell her how close I'd come to losing it, how easily things could have gone the other way if I'd doubted myself just a little more. At 75, I understood how thin the line is between autonomy and erasure, especially for women like me, quiet, practical, unassuming. Claire had almost stepped over that line with me. The report stopped her legally. The boundaries stopped her personally. And the distance gave me back my life. I don't know what she tells herself now. I don't need to. That story no longer includes me. What I know is this. I wake up each day knowing my thoughts are my own. My decisions are mine. My mistakes belong to me, not to someone waiting to collect them. That may not look like victory from the outside, but to a woman who was nearly written out of her own life, it is everything. Claire tried one last time to regain what she'd lost. It came in the form of a letter, not a call. 3 pages, carefully typed. No accusations, no threats, just reason. She wrote about family, about aging, about regret. She said she'd spoken to people who specialize in reconciliation. She said distance was unhealthy. She said I was isolating myself and that isolation could be mistaken for decline. Even now, she couldn't stop framing concern as diagnosis. I read the letter once, then again, more slowly. Not to analyze it, to notice what was missing. There was no apology. Not for the notes. Not for the conversations behind my back. Not for the way she'd prepared professionals to distrust me before I'd spoken a word. Instead, there was reassurance, reframing, a gentle insistence that things had gotten out of hand, as if they'd slipped accidentally from her grasp. She ended the letter by suggesting a mediated conversation, a neutral third party, someone to help us move forward. What she wanted was a reset. What she didn't understand was that resets only work when both people want to return to the same place. I didn't. I took my time responding. Not out of strategy, out of respect for myself. When I finally wrote back, it was brief. 1 page, handwritten. I told her I wished her well, I told her I was not interested in mediation. I told her that our relationship, as it had been, was no longer acceptable to me. I did not explain. I did not justify. At the bottom, I wrote one sentence that I knew she would understand. Contact me only if you are willing to speak to me as an equal. Weeks passed, then months. She didn't respond. I heard through others that she was angry, that she felt humiliated, that she told people I'd turned against her after the evaluation. Some believed her. Most didn't bother choosing sides. I noticed something else during that time. Without Claire's constant presence, I began remembering myself more clearly. Not the version she described, the one I had lived as. The woman who handled emergencies calmly. The woman who ran a household alone. The woman who made decisions without applause. I started volunteering twice a week at the library. Nothing dramatic. Shelving books. Helping children find the right section. Being useful without being managed. One afternoon, a young woman asked if I was retired. I said yes. She smiled and said, "You seem very capable." I laughed all the way home. That word had come back to me again from a stranger, without paperwork. Claire never did accept responsibility. I didn't expect her to. People who rely on control rarely see themselves as harmful. They see themselves as necessary. What she lost wasn't her reputation. It was access. Access to my thoughts, my routines, my vulnerabilities. The soft places she once stepped into without asking. And once access is gone, there's nothing left to manage. At 75, I finally understood that boundaries don't require agreement, only enforcement. I don't know if my daughter will ever understand what she did. I don't know if she'll ever see that concern, when it ignores consent, becomes something else entirely. But I know this. I am no longer waiting for her to change. I have my life back. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but fully. And that is more than enough. By the time the legal paperwork was finished, the air around me felt different. Not lighter, clearer. I hadn't gone looking for confrontation. But after everything that had happened, there were practical matters that could no longer be left vague. My doctor suggested it gently. A lawyer I trusted confirmed it without drama. Boundaries, they said, only work when they're supported by structure. So I put things in order. I updated my medical directives, removed names that no longer belonged there, added one trusted friend, nothing more. I reviewed my finances with a quiet man who spoke plainly and didn't rush me. He looked at me once over his glasses and said, "You're very organized." I smiled. I had always been. There was no grand gesture, no punishment hidden in the paperwork. Claire didn't lose anything she was entitled to. She simply lost access she'd assumed would always be hers. When she found out, and she did, inevitably, she reacted exactly as I expected. She accused me of being influenced, of acting out of spite, of letting strangers come between us. I listened to the message once, then I deleted it. I didn't feel cruel. I felt done. What surprised me most was not her reaction, but my own lack of hesitation. There was no inner debate this time, no voice asking if I was being too harsh, no late-night replay of conversations. The ground beneath me finally felt solid. We speak so much about forgiveness, especially when it comes to family, as if blood alone obligates endless access, as if age means surrender. No one talks enough about responsibility. Not legal responsibility, moral responsibility. The responsibility not to erase someone under the guise of love. The responsibility not to weaponize concern. The responsibility to stop when the other person says no. Claire had failed that responsibility, and I had failed myself by excusing it for too long. That understanding didn't come with anger. It came with a quiet sadness, followed by relief. I began marking time differently, not by appointments or phone calls, but by seasons. I noticed how long the mornings stayed bright, how my hands moved more easily without tension, how my thoughts no longer circled the same questions. Once, while sorting old photographs, I found a picture of Claire as a child, sitting at the kitchen table, serious and determined even then. I studied her face for a long time. I didn't tear the photo. I didn't put it away either. Some things don't need fixing or discarding. They just need to be seen clearly. People ask me now, carefully, if I miss my daughter. I say, I miss who I thought she was. That answer usually ends the conversation. At 75, I have learned that peace doesn't come from resolution. It comes from alignment, from living in a way that no longer contradicts your own dignity. The psychiatrist's report may have started this process, but it didn't finish it. What finished it was my decision to stop negotiating my reality. I don't know what Claire tells herself now. I don't wonder how she explains the distance. That work belongs to her. Mine is simpler. I wake up. I live my day. I make choices without fear of being corrected or reframed. I trust my own mind, not because a report says I can, but because I always could. That trust, once broken, is not easily restored, but once it is, nothing can quietly take it away again. Life after the storm didn't look the way people imagine recovery. There was no sudden happiness, no bright turning point where everything felt earned and resolved. What there was instead was quiet consistency. Days that belonged to me from beginning to end. I woke without checking my phone. I chose what to eat without commentary. I spent entire afternoons without explaining myself to anyone. That may sound small, but after years of being interpreted, it felt enormous. I began noticing how much energy I'd once spent bracing. Bracing for correction. Bracing for misunderstanding. Bracing for the subtle tightening in my chest whenever Claire's name appeared on the screen. That tension was gone now. In its place came something steadier. Not joy, not relief. Presence. I walked more. Slowly, deliberately. I let myself stop on benches, not because I was tired, but because I could. I listened to conversations around me without feeling watched. I spoke when I wanted to. I stayed quiet when I didn't. People treated me differently too, though they probably didn't realize it. They no longer checked my face for signs of confusion. No longer softened their voices. No longer glanced at an imaginary authority to see if they should believe me. It turns out respect is contagious. Once one institution corrected its posture, others followed. I started cooking again, properly. Not quick meals designed to get me through the day, but slow ones. Soups that simmered. Bread that needed time. I ate at the table, not standing at the counter like someone waiting to be interrupted. Some evenings were lonely. I won't pretend otherwise. Silence can ache when you're honest with it, but it was a clean ache, not the anxious one I used to live with. I learned the difference. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. Claire as a teenager, slamming a door. Claire as a young woman, asking for advice she never took. Claire as an adult, already certain she knew better. I didn't chase those memories away. I let them pass through me like weather. I had spent too many years editing my feelings for other people's comfort. I wasn't going to do that anymore, even for myself. One afternoon, a neighbor asked if I'd consider moving closer to family eventually. The word was gentle, well-meaning. I'm exactly where I need to be, I said. And I meant it. At 75, you stop fantasizing about alternative lives. You begin inhabiting the one you have fully, or not at all. I chose fully. There was no reconciliation, no dramatic final conversation. Claire and I existed in separate orbits now. That separation wasn't punishment. It was consequence, and it was peace. I thought often about how close I'd come to losing everything quietly, how easily a softer woman, a more doubtful woman, could have been documented out of her own life. That thought didn't frighten me anymore. It sharpened me. I began speaking more plainly to others. When I saw women my age being talked over, I interrupted. Politely, firmly. When someone joked about forgetfulness, I didn't laugh along. I didn't lecture either. I simply didn't participate. Small acts. Steady ones. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was living one. There is a dignity that comes late in life if you're willing to claim it. Not the dignity of being admired or praised, but the dignity of not being moved when others push. I had that now. No one could take it without force, and force would have required a fight they no longer had the authority to start. The psychiatrist's report sat in a folder I rarely opened. It had done its job. I didn't need to reread it to remember who I was. I had lived as her long before anyone wrote it down. And as the months passed, I stopped thinking of what I'd escaped. I began thinking only of what remained. Time, choice, quiet, enough. I am 75 years old, and this is the first season of my life that belongs entirely to me. Not because I won something, not because I proved anything, but because I stopped allowing myself to be quietly overwritten. People assume that when a story like mine ends, there must be triumph, closure, a final conversation where everything is said and understood. That is not how it happens most of the time. Most of the time, it ends with a woman standing in her own kitchen, making tea, and realizing that no one is watching her anymore. That realization changes everything. I no longer measure my days by whether someone approves of them. I no longer soften my opinions before they leave my mouth. I no longer wonder if my calm will be mistaken for weakness or my firmness for instability. Those fears belonged to a version of me that was slowly being erased. She didn't disappear all at once. She faded politely. She made room. She explained herself too much. She trusted love even when it came with conditions. I carry her with me, but I don't live as her anymore. My daughter still exists in the world. So do her choices. So do the consequences of them. I don't track either. That, too, is a form of freedom. What I know now, what I wish someone had told me years ago, is this. You do not lose your dignity all at once. You give it away in pieces, usually to keep the peace. And one day, you look up and realize there is very little left. Getting it back does not require anger. It requires clarity. Clarity is quiet. It does not argue. It does not beg to be believed. It simply stands. That psychiatrist did not save me. The report did not give me a spine I lacked. All it did was remove the last excuse I had for doubting myself. I was always sane. I was always capable. I was simply surrounded by someone who needed me not to be. At my age, people like to say, "What's done is done." They say it as if time excuses everything. It doesn't. Time reveals. And when it does, you are allowed, at any age, to step out of the version of yourself that was convenient for others and into the one that is true. That is what I did. Not loudly, not publicly, not cruelly. I did it by refusing to participate in my own diminishment. If you are reading this and recognizing yourself, if you have ever been spoken for, corrected, softened, documented, or gently pushed aside under the name of concern, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not difficult, and it is not too late. Not at 50, not at 60, not at 75. Dignity does not expire. If this story resonated with you, if it felt familiar in a way you couldn't quite name, you're not alone. Share it. Leave a comment. Let someone else know they're not alone either. Sometimes, the most powerful thing an older woman can do is speak calmly, clearly, and refuse to disappear.